The prescription bottle says take one tablet by mouth every 12 hours as needed for anxiety. But I've been taking 3 at a time for the past 6 months, and it barely keeps my hands from shaking. I'm standing in my kitchen in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, watching the second hand on my wall clock move counterclockwise. It's been doing that for about 20 minutes now, ticking backward 1 second at a time, while the minute and hour hands continue forward like nothing's wrong. I know it's not really happening. Dr. Patricia Vance, my Navy-assigned psychiatrist, would tell me it's a visual hallucination brought on by untreated trauma and sleep deprivation. She'd adjust my medication again and schedule another session where I'd sit in her office with its fake plants and motivational posters and lie about how much better I'm feeling. But I've learned to tell the difference between what's in my head and what's actually wrong with reality. The clock hands, they're not a hallucination. Or they are, but not the kind Dr. Vance thinks. They're a reminder, a symptom of what happened aboard the USS Razorback during our patrol 8 months ago, when time stopped being a reliable constant and started behaving like something negotiable. My name is Christopher Walsh. I'm 32 years old. Until 8 months ago, I was a lieutenant junior grade in the United States Navy, qualified as officer of the deck on nuclear submarines. I'd spent 7 years underwater, working my way up from ensign to a trusted watch officer on one of the Navy's most advanced fast attack boats. I was good at my job, really good. The kind of officer that gets early recommendations for department head positions and fast-tracked for command someday. Then the Razorback went to the Barents Sea on what should have been a routine intelligence gathering mission, and I watched our depth gauge grow hands like a clock while we descended into water that existed in multiple times simultaneously. The Navy's official report calls it catastrophic instrumentation failure, resulting in crew disorientation and psychological trauma. They've classified everything related to that patrol at levels that make most admirals' security clearances look like grocery store memberships. 47 crew members received medical discharges, 12 are in long-term psychiatric facilities, 3 disappeared entirely after debriefing, just gone from the Navy's records like they never existed. I got the standard package: honorable discharge, full disability benefits, a file stamped with enough restrictions that talking about what really happened would constitute treason, and a check for $73,000 labeled consulting compensation. They gave me a new service record that showed a medical discharge for vestibular dysfunction and associated psychological complications, and told me I should feel grateful the Navy was taking care of its own. What they didn't give me was any way to fix what's wrong with my perception of time. It started small. I'd look at my watch and see 3:45, then glance away and look back to find it showing 3:42. Not a malfunction. I'd check my phone and it would confirm the earlier time, like those 3 minutes had just unhappened. Then I started experiencing what Dr. Vance calls temporal displacement events. I'd be making breakfast and suddenly I'd be eating lunch with no memory of the hours in between. Or I'd go to sleep at night and wake up the next afternoon, having somehow skipped 20 hours. The worst part is the memories that don't match the timeline. I remember my sister's wedding happening last June and also last October. I remember my nephew being born in 2019 and also 2021. I remember conversations with my ex-girlfriend Sarah that she swears never happened, arguments we had about things that haven't occurred yet according to her timeline. My life is becoming unstuck in time, experiencing events in wrong order or multiple times or not at all, and the only people who might understand what's happening to me are either in psychiatric wards or disappeared or dead. I pour another cup of coffee, even though it's 11 p.m. according to the forward-moving clock hands. Sleep is complicated when you can't trust that the time you go to bed will be the time you wake up. Last week, I fell asleep on a Tuesday night and woke up the previous Monday morning, reliving an entire day I'd already experienced. Dr. Vance says that's impossible, that I'm confusing dreams with reality. But I had bruises that appeared on Monday's timeline before the accident on Tuesday that caused them. Time isn't working right anymore. Not for me. Not since the Razorback descended past the crush depth where water pressure should have imploded our hull, but instead opened us into somewhere else, somewhen else. My phone buzzes with a text from my mom. "Chris, please call me. It's been 3 weeks and I'm worried." I stare at the message, confused. I talked to my mom yesterday, or I think I did. Maybe that was last week, or next week? The memories are there, but they don't connect to specific dates anymore, just floating in a soup of disconnected moments. I text back, "I'm okay, Mom, just busy. I'll call soon."
That's what you said 3 weeks ago. And 2 weeks before that. Please, Chris, your father and I need to know you're safe. 3 weeks. 2 weeks. The timestamps don't mean anything to me anymore. Linear time is a concept I understand intellectually but can't seem to experience consistently. My life has become a shuffled deck of moments, each one occurring but in random order, and I'm losing track of which version of events is the correct timeline. The wall clock's second hand stops moving backward and instead starts ticking forward again, double speed, making up for lost time. I watch it chase the minute hand around the clock face and feel that familiar vertigo, that sense that reality is thinner than it should be. Dr. Vance would say I should take my medication and try to sleep, that my symptoms are manageable with proper treatment and therapy, that what I experienced aboard the Razorback was traumatic but not supernatural, and my brain is creating elaborate delusions to process events it can't otherwise understand. But Dr. Vance wasn't there. She didn't see Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reed age 40 years in the span of a watch rotation. She didn't watch our depth gauge sprout those delicate brass hands and start counting time instead of pressure. She didn't feel the submarine slip sideways through depths that corresponded to dates instead of fathoms, where descending 100 feet meant traveling backward 12 hours. 8 months ago, I was a competent naval officer with a promising career ahead of me. Now I'm a 29-year-old with gaps in my memory and a wall clock that can't decide which direction time should move, living in an apartment I sometimes remember buying in 2022 and sometimes remember inheriting from a grandfather who's still alive. I need to write this down while I can still remember it linearly, while I can still organize the events of that patrol into a narrative that moves forward instead of looping back on itself, because I'm losing coherence. The memories are fragmenting, experiencing themselves in wrong order, and soon I won't be able to tell anyone what really happened. Someone needs to know what we found at those coordinates the Navy sent us to investigate, what it did to us when we tried to understand it, and why the depth gauge growing clock hands was just the first sign that we'd descended into waters where the normal rules of physics and time didn't apply. This is what happened when we went down there, when we learned that the ocean's depths aren't measured in feet or meters or atmospheres of pressure, but in years and decades and centuries of time compressed into vertical space. This is why you should never, ever trust your instruments when they start showing you something impossible. And this is what happens to people who survive encountering places where time flows downward instead of forward. The orders came through on a Tuesday morning in March. I remember that with unusual certainty because it was one of the last dates I experienced in a proper sequence before everything started coming apart. I was sitting in the wardroom of the USS Razorback at Naval Base Groton, Connecticut, reviewing training schedules with our executive officer, Lieutenant Commander David Martinez. The XO was methodical and detail-oriented, the kind of officer who made sure every procedure was followed exactly, every checklist completed thoroughly. We'd been working together for 6 months and had developed a good professional rhythm. "New tasking just came through from Subland," Martinez said, sliding a sealed envelope across the table. "Captain wants you to review the patrol orders and coordinate with the navigator on route planning." I opened the envelope and pulled out the mission brief. It was stamped with the usual classification markings, nothing unusual there. Fast attack submarines ran classified missions constantly. What caught my attention was the specific operations area. The Barents Sea? I looked up at Martinez. That's pretty far north for this time of year. Ice Edge is retreating earlier than normal, creates opportunities for intelligence gathering before the Russians fully resume their summer operations tempo. I scanned through the rest of the brief. Standard surveillance tasking: monitor Russian naval activity, gather signal intelligence on their submarine movements, maintain stealth profile. 60-day patrol. Transit time 2 weeks each way. We'd be operating in waters where Russian Northern Fleet submarines regularly trained and deployed, playing cat and mouse with their attack boats and boomers. What's the op tempo? I asked. Moderate. Sublant wants us in position by the 15th of next month. We'll have a 3-week window to collect intelligence before rotating out for the next boat. Martinez paused, and I noticed something in his expression. There's an additional tasking in the appendix, classified higher than the main brief. I flipped to the back of the document and found a single page with additional restrictions stamped across the top. The content was brief. During transit to primary operations area, investigate acoustic anomaly at coordinates 72 degrees 14 north, 35 degrees 18 east. Duration 48 hours maximum. Maintain ECOM Alpha. Report findings via emergency backup communications only. Acoustic anomaly? I read the coordinates again. Those were in the middle of the Norwegian Sea, nowhere near our primary mission area. What kind of anomaly?
Brief doesn't specify. Captain got a separate call from Sublant Intelligence after the orders came through. Apparently, 2 NATO submarines detected unusual sounds at those coordinates over the past 4 months. Non-biological, non-geological. Doesn't match any known signatures. I felt a small prickle of unease. Secondary tasking added to primary missions usually meant someone at Naval Intelligence was interested in something they didn't want to make a big deal about publicly. Acoustic anomalies could be anything from experimental Russian equipment to underwater volcanic activity to equipment glitches. Usually nothing exciting, but the classified appendix suggested this was different. Are we coordinating with the other submarines that detected these sounds? I asked. Martinez shook his head. Negative. This is solo investigation. Get in, collect data for 48 hours, get out. Minimal loiter time. That was unusual. Normally, when investigating unknown contacts, Sublant would have multiple platforms working together, cross-referencing data to eliminate false positives. Going in solo suggested either they didn't think the anomaly was important enough to waste resources on, or they wanted to keep a very low profile on whatever this was. Understood. I'll coordinate with Lieutenant Greer on navigation and the sonar division on monitoring protocols. The next 2 weeks passed in the usual pre-deployment blur. Equipment checks, crew qualifications, stores loading, final briefings. The Razorback was a Virginia-class fast attack boat, one of the Navy's newest and most capable submarines. Her systems were state-of-the-art, her crew was experienced and professional. I'd served on her for 3 years and felt confident in our ability to handle whatever mission Sublant threw at us. Lieutenant Sarah Greer was our navigator, a sharp officer who'd graduated top of her class from the Naval Academy and could plot courses through ice fields with the precision of a surgeon. We spent hours going over the route to the acoustic anomaly site, calculating depths and currents and optimal approach angles. These coordinates are in pretty deep water, she noted during one of our planning sessions. Bottom contours show we'll be operating over the John Mayen fracture zone. Depths exceed 3,000 meters in some areas. Crush depth concerns? I asked. Not for the Razorback. We're rated well beyond that, but the terrain is complex. Underwater ridges, steep drop-offs, strong currents, makes for interesting navigation. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reed stopped by during that session. Reed was our sonar division chief, 22 years in the Navy, with more knowledge about underwater acoustics in his left thumb than most officers acquired in entire careers. He'd been reviewing the anomaly tasking and had questions. "Sir, this brief mentions unusual sounds, but doesn't give us any specifics on frequency range or signature characteristics. Makes it hard to configure our arrays for optimal detection." "That's all the information Sublant provided. We'll have to go in with standard configurations and adjust based on what we detect." Reed looked skeptical. "In my experience, when intelligence is vague about what they want us to find, it's because they don't know or they don't want to tell us. Either way makes me nervous." I appreciated Reed's directness. Good chiefs weren't afraid to voice concerns, even when talking to officers. "What's your recommendation?" "Run our arrays in wideband mode. Capture everything across the entire frequency spectrum. We can filter and analyze later. Better to have too much data than miss something because we configured too narrow." "Agreed. Make it happen." We deployed on April 1st under gray skies and drizzling rain, the Razorback slipping beneath the surface of Long Island Sound with practiced ease. Within hours, we'd settled into the deep water transit routine, running quiet and deep as we headed northeast toward the Norwegian Sea. I loved submarine duty. There was something profound about being disconnected from the surface world, from constant connectivity and news cycles and all the noise of modern life. Down here, we existed in a bubble of controlled environment, focused entirely on the mission and the crew and the ocean around us. My watches as officer of the deck followed comfortable patterns. Monitor the navigation, coordinate with sonar and engineering, maintain situational awareness of contacts and environmental conditions. The Atlantic in early spring was active with biologics, whales migrating, fish spawning, the constant background symphony of ocean life. On our 5th day of transit, we passed through the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, the narrow waters where the Atlantic meets the Arctic Ocean. The temperature dropped noticeably. Ice warnings became more frequent. We'd entered waters where Soviet submarines had hunted NATO forces during the Cold War, where the game of underwater cat and mouse had been played with nuclear stakes. Lieutenant Martinez found me in the wardroom during my off-watch period on day 7. "We'll be approaching the Anomaly coordinates in about 8 hours," he said. "Captain wants a planning session at 2000 to review investigation protocols."
I'll be there. Has sonar picked up anything unusual so far? Negative. Normal ocean noise, some distant surface traffic, nothing that matches what the other boats reported. The planning session that evening included the captain, Commander James Hawthorne, a veteran submariner with 25 years of experience, Martinez, Greer, Reed, and myself. We crowded into the captain's stateroom and reviewed our approach plan. "We'll slow to 4 knots at a range of 20 nautical miles," Captain Hawthorne explained, pointing to the chart. "That gives us time to listen passively before reaching the coordinates. If we detect anything unusual, we adjust our approach accordingly. If we detect nothing, we'll proceed to the coordinates and begin a spiral search pattern." "What's the depth at the site?" I asked Greer. "Variable. The fracture zone creates complex bathymetry. Depths range from 2,800 meters on the ridges to over 4,000 meters in the troughs. We'll maintain 300 meters depth unless sonar recommends going deeper for optimal acoustic conditions," Hawthorne continued. "Chief Reed, what's your division's posture?" Reed pulled out his notes. "Sir, we've configured our arrays for wideband passive monitoring. No active sonar unless specifically authorized. We're recording everything for later analysis. I've got my most experienced operators on watch during the investigation window." "Good. Remember, we've got 48 hours maximum at these coordinates. In and out, minimal exposure. The Russians know these waters well, and we don't want to advertise our presence." We ran through the plan twice more, refining details and establishing communication protocols. By 2100 hours, everyone knew their roles and expectations. I had the mid-watch that night, midnight to 0600 hours. I relieved the previous officer of the deck at 2345 and settled into the command position in the control room. The crew was professional and alert. Everything felt routine. At 0147, we reached the 20-mile point and reduced speed to 4 knots. The submarine became even quieter, her reactor barely audible, her propulsor making almost no noise. We were in maximum stealth configuration, listening to the ocean around us. I called down to sonar. "Sonar, officer of the deck, what's the picture?" Petty Officer First Class Jennifer Wu was on the displays. She'd worked with Reed for 3 years and had exceptional ears for detecting faint contacts. "Sonar, officer of the deck, holding normal ocean background, some biologics to the north, no man-made contacts, no unusual acoustic activity. Continue monitoring. Call me immediately if you detect anything. Sonar, aye." The hours passed slowly. We crept toward the coordinates like a ghost, listening carefully, watching our instruments, maintaining perfect situational awareness. The crew had done this hundreds of times, approaching a position of interest, gathering intelligence, remaining undetected. Routine submarine operations. At 0438, we reached the exact coordinates listed in our tasking. I had Greer confirm our position 3 times using multiple navigation systems. We were precisely where we were supposed to be. And there was nothing unusual. Normal ocean noise, normal bathymetry, normal everything. "Sonar, officer of the deck, anything on your screens?" "Negative, sir. All quiet." I conferred with Martinez via the sound-powered phone. "XO, we're at the coordinates. Sonar reports nothing unusual. Recommend we proceed with the spiral search pattern." "Concur. Execute the search." We began a slow, circular pattern, gradually widening our search radius from the original coordinates. Hour after hour, we listened and heard nothing except ocean. My watch ended at 0600. I briefed my relief and headed to the wardroom for breakfast, feeling vaguely disappointed. I'd half expected something interesting, some mysterious signal or unusual contact. But apparently, this was just a wild goose chase, following up on acoustic anomalies that were probably just equipment glitches or misidentified biological sounds. I grabbed some powdered eggs and coffee and was about to sit down when Chief Reed appeared, his expression troubled. "Sir, you got a minute?" "Of course, Chief. What's up?" He slid into the booth across from me and pulled out a small notebook. "I've been reviewing the data from our approach and initial search, and I'm finding something weird in the recordings." "Weird how?" "There's structure in the background noise, very subtle, almost below our detection threshold. But when I filter out the normal ocean sounds and boost the low frequencies, there's a pattern, like a pulse, regular intervals, very low frequency, barely detectable." He showed me a printout of his analysis. I saw what he meant. A subtle variation in the background noise level, rising and falling in a pattern that was too regular to be natural. "What's the frequency?" I asked. "About 0.3 hertz, 1 cycle every 3 seconds. That was remarkably low, well below the range of human hearing, down in the range where you'd feel vibration more than hear it. Submarines could detect sounds at these frequencies, but they were usually from geological sources, undersea earthquakes, volcanic activity, tectonic plate movements." "Could be geological," I suggested. "We're over a fracture zone." Reed nodded slowly. "That's what I thought initially, but geological sounds are chaotic, irregular. This is too consistent. It's been maintaining the exact same pattern for the past 8 hours, no variation." I felt that prickle of unease again. "Have you shown this to the captain?" "Not yet. Wanted to confirm with the ODD first before raising it up." "Let's take it to him now." Captain Hawthorne was in his stateroom, reviewing message traffic. We knocked, and he invited us in, setting aside his paperwork when he saw Reed's charts. "What have you got, Chief?" Reed explained the low-frequency pattern he'd discovered. Hawthorne studied the analysis carefully, his experienced eyes picking out details I'd missed. "How long has this been present?"
"Hard to say, sir. It's subtle enough that we might have missed it during our approach, but it's definitely been there since we arrived at the coordinates. Continuous, unchanging pattern." Hawthorne pulled up a navigation chart. "Could it be coming from the seafloor? Some kind of geothermal activity?" "Possible, sir, but the signature doesn't match known geological sources, and the precision of the interval. It's exacted within milliseconds. Geological processes aren't that regular." We all understood what that implied. Regular, precise patterns suggested some kind of machinery or deliberate signaling. Natural phenomena were chaotic and variable. We'll go deeper, Hawthorne decided. Take us down to 500 meters, see if the signature changes or strengthens. And Chief, I want continuous analysis. Document everything. Aye, sir. I was technically off watch, but Hawthorne asked me to stay in the control room as we descended. Martinez came on duty early as well. We were all curious about this mysterious signal, this subtle pulse that our most experienced sonar chief thought was too precise to be natural. The descent was controlled and gradual. 300 meters, 350, 400. The hull creaked slightly as water pressure increased, normal sounds that every submariner knew. Our depth gauge showed the numbers climbing steadily, the needle moving smoothly around the dial. At 475 meters, I noticed something strange. The depth gauge needle was moving, but there was a slight hesitation in its motion. A tiny pause every few degrees, almost imperceptible. I thought my eyes were playing tricks, so I looked away and then back. No, it was definitely happening. The needle would advance smoothly, then pause for maybe a quarter second, then continue. The pause occurred with regular timing, once every few seconds. I tapped the gauge with my finger, thinking it might be a mechanical issue. The needle continued its strange behavior. XO, you seeing this? I pointed to the depth gauge. Martinez leaned in close, watching the needle. After a few seconds, he nodded. Yeah, looks like it's sticking slightly. Probably needs recalibration. But even as he said it, I noticed something else. During those brief pauses, the needle seemed to twitch. Not backward or forward exactly, but as if it were trying to move in a direction perpendicular to its normal motion, like it wanted to point somewhere other than along the circular path of the gauge. We should have the A-Gang check that after this evolution, Martinez made a note. A-Gang was engineering's maintenance division. They could inspect and recalibrate the gauge. We continued the descent. 500 meters. Chief Reed called up from sonar. Officer of the deck, sonar. The low-frequency pattern is strengthening, and sir, there's something else. As we descended, I'm picking up harmonics at higher frequencies, like the low-frequency signal is a fundamental and there are overtones building on top of it. Can you characterize the harmonics? Martinez asked. Working on it, sir, but they're following mathematical progressions, clean integer multiples of the fundamental frequency. That was definitely not geological. Natural sounds didn't create perfect harmonic series. Hawthorne ordered us to maintain depth at 500 meters while sonar conducted detailed analysis. We hovered in the water column, our position-keeping system making tiny adjustments to keep us stable. I kept glancing at the depth gauge. The needle's strange behavior had stopped once we leveled off. It now pointed steadily at 500 meters with no twitching or hesitation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with it. During a quiet moment, I stepped over to the navigation station where Greer was working. Do we have a backup depth gauge I can reference? I asked quietly. She pulled up a digital display showing depth data from multiple sensors, the analog gauge, digital pressure sensors, sonar ranging to the bottom. All showed the same reading, 500 meters, plus or minus 2 meters for normal variation. Everything's aligned, she said. Why? Just the analog gauge was acting weird during descent. Wanted to confirm it's accurate. Engineering did a full calibration check before we deployed. It should be good. Should be. But that needle's strange behavior nagged at me. Reed called up again. Sir, we're getting some really interesting data here. The harmonic series has expanded to include at least 12 distinct frequency components, all mathematically related, and there's structure within each frequency. Modulation patterns that look almost like... He trailed off. Like what, Chief? Hawthorne prompted. Like information encoding, sir. Like someone's broadcasting a very low-frequency signal with data modulated onto it. The control room went very quiet. Elaborate, Hawthorne said. Sir, I'm seeing patterns that match digital communication protocols. Header structures, what might be data packets, even what looks like error correction codes. This isn't natural. This is engineered. Hawthorne and Martinez exchanged glances. This had just stopped being a routine investigation of acoustic anomalies and become something much more significant. Could it be Russian? Martinez asked.
Unknown, sir. The encoding doesn't match any classified communication protocols in our databases. It's different, more complex than anything we've cataloged. Hawthorne made a decision. Continue analysis, but maintain Econ Alpha. No transmissions, no active sonar, purely passive monitoring. I want to know what this is before we report anything. For the next 6 hours, the Razorback hovered at 500 meters while our sonar division pulled apart the mysterious signal. Reed and his team worked in shifts, analyzing every component, trying to decode what the signal might be communicating. I grabbed a few hours of sleep and then returned to the control room for my evening watch. Martinez was still there, hadn't left his post. The strain was showing on his face. "Any progress?" I asked as I relieved the previous OOD. Reed thinks he's identified a repeating pattern in the modulation. Shows up every 47 seconds. He's trying to figure out if it's some kind of marker or synchronization pulse. I settled into the command position and scanned the instruments. Everything looked normal, except the depth gauge needle was twitching again. Not the hesitation I'd seen during descent. This was different. The needle was pointing at 500 meters as expected, but every few seconds it would twitch clockwise slightly, maybe a few degrees, then sprint back to the correct position, like it was trying to point somewhere else but being pulled back. I watched it for several minutes, trying to establish a pattern. The twitches seemed random at first, but then I noticed they synchronized with something. I checked my watch. The depth gauge needle twitched exactly once every 3 seconds, the same interval as the low-frequency pulse Reed had detected. I felt cold realization wash over me. The gauge wasn't malfunctioning, it was responding to the signal somehow, trying to indicate something other than depth. But what? I called down to sonar. "Chief Reed, what's the exact interval of that low-frequency pulse?" 0.33 hertz, sir. One pulse every 3 seconds. Why? The depth gauge is twitching in sync with the pulse. Every 3 seconds, the needle tries to move clockwise. Silence on the other end. Then, "Sir, I'm coming up to the control room." Reed arrived 2 minutes later. I showed him the gauge behavior. We watched together as the needle twitched clockwise, returned, twitched again in perfect synchronization with his recorded pulse. "That's not possible," he said quietly. "The gauge is a mechanical pressure sensor. It shouldn't respond to acoustic signals." "But it is," I replied. Martinez had moved over to observe as well. "Could be vibration from the signal. If the pulse is strong enough, maybe it's causing physical vibration that affects the mechanism." Reed shook his head. "Sir, that signal is incredibly faint. We can barely detect it with our most sensitive arrays. It's nowhere near powerful enough to cause mechanical vibration of ship components." We stared at the gauge for a long moment. Then Reed said something that made my skin crawl. "Unless it's not the gauge responding to the signal, what if the signal is trying to communicate something about depth or about time?" "Time?" Martinez frowned. "What do you mean?" "Sir, depth and time are both measurements along a dimension. One's vertical, one's temporal. If something wanted to indicate time passage, it might use an instrument designed to measure depth as an analog." I looked at the gauge again, the needle pointing at 500 meters, twitching clockwise every 3 seconds, trying to move forward around the dial, like a clock hand, trying to count seconds. "That's insane," I said. "Is it?" Reed pulled out his notebook. "What if this signal isn't about location in space? What if it's about location in time?" Before anyone could respond, something happened that changed everything. The depth gauge needle stopped twitching. Instead, it began to grow. I'm not speaking metaphorically. The needle, the brass pointer that indicated depth, began to physically elongate.
A second, smaller hand emerged from the center of the gauge, growing outward like a plant sprouting. Then a third hand, even smaller. Within 30 seconds, our depth gauge had hour, minute, and second hands. It had become a clock. Everyone in the control room saw it. The needles were real, solid, made of brass that gleamed under the control room lights. The original depth markings remained on the dial face, but now clock numerals appeared, overlaying the depth measurements. It showed 11:47:23, and the second hand was ticking. "Sonar, officer of the deck," I managed to say into the phone, my voice sounding stranger to my own ears. "Are you seeing any changes in the signal pattern?" Reed's voice came back, shaken. "Sir, the harmonic series just collapsed into a single pure tone. Frequency is exactly 1 hertz, 1 pulse per second." I looked at the depth gauge turned clock. The second hand ticked, 1 second per tick, synchronized with Reed's signal. "Captain to the control room," Martinez called over the announcing system. "Captain to the control room immediately." Hawthorne arrived within a minute, still buttoning his shirt. He stopped dead when he saw the gauge. "What the hell is that?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. "Sir, it grew hands," I said. "About 2 minutes ago, the gauge needle elongated and 2 additional hands emerged. It's showing time now instead of depth." Hawthorne moved closer, examining the gauge. He reached out slowly and tapped it. The clock hands continued their steady ticking, completely unaffected.
"Is this some kind of malfunction?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew it wasn't. "Sir, it's solid brass," Martinez said. "You can't just grow metal components. This isn't possible." Reed had followed the captain to the control room. "Sir, I think it's connected to the signal. When the gauge transformed, the acoustic pattern changed to a pure 1 hertz tone. The signal is controlling this somehow." Hawthorne stared at the clock for a long moment. "What time does it show?" 23:47 local time, sir," I replied, "which matches our ship's time exactly." "All right." Hawthorne's command training kicked in. "We are ascending to 200 meters immediately. Secure from investigation and prepare to get distance from these coordinates. Whatever's happening here is beyond our capability to analyze safely." "Aye, sir." "Dive, make your depth 200 meters. The dive officer acknowledged and began flooding ballast tanks to establish upward buoyancy. The deck tilted slightly as we began to rise. The clock hands began spinning backward. Not just moving counterclockwise, actually spinning faster and faster as if time was rewinding. The second hand became a blur. The minute hand whipped around the dial. The hour hand rotated backward through the hours. "Belay the ascent," Hawthorne ordered. "Dive, maintain current depth." We leveled off at 500 meters again. The clock hands slowed their backward spin, stopped, and then resumed forward movement at normal speed, showing 11:47 p.m., like the ascent had never happened. "Did anyone else just experience that?" Martinez asked quietly. We all nodded. We'd felt the deck tilt, felt the submarine rising, but the depth gauge, now showing both depth and time, indicated we'd never moved. We were still at 500 meters, and the clock showed the same time it had shown before the ascent attempt. "Sir Reed," Hawthorne said carefully, "what's your assessment of what just happened?" Reed looked pale. "Sir, I think we just experienced temporal regression. We tried to ascend, but something reverted us to a previous state. The clock showed us being returned to the moment before we attempted the ascent." "That's impossible." "I agree, sir, but I don't have any other explanation." Hawthorne was quiet for a moment. "Try the ascent again, slowly this time. I want to see if the effect repeats." I gave the order, and the Razorback began to rise. We all watched the clock hands. As soon as we'd climbed 10 meters, they started moving backward again. "All stop," Hawthorne ordered. The backward movement stopped.
The hands resumed forward motion. We'd been trapped, not in space, but in time. We were at 500 meters at 11:47 p.m., and something wouldn't let us leave. "Sir," Greer said from the navigation station, "I'm showing our position has changed." Everyone turned to look. She pulled up the electronic chart. "We're 3.2 nautical miles southwest of where we were when the gauge transformed, but I have no record of us moving. Our logs show we've been maintaining position the whole time." "Check with sonar. Did they detect any self-noise from maneuvering?" I called down. Reed's response came back negative. According to sonar, we hadn't moved. Our propulsor hadn't engaged. No ballast changes, nothing. But the navigation system said we'd moved over 3 miles. "It's not just time," I said, the realization dawning. "It's space, too. We're moving through both dimensions, but not in the normal way. We're being displaced." The clock hands ticked steadily forward. 11:48 p.m. now. "Sonar, any change in the acoustic signal?" "Negative, sir. Still showing the pure 1 Hz tone, steady and constant." We stood there in the control room, watching our depth gauge count time instead of pressure, trying to process what was happening. We were stuck at a specific moment in space-time, unable to deviate from it, while something unknown used our instruments to measure dimensions we couldn't directly observe. I thought about Reed's earlier words. Depth and time are both measurements along a dimension. What if we weren't really at 500 meters in the ocean? What if we'd descended into something else entirely? A depth measured in time rather than distance, where going deeper meant traveling further into the past or future. And if that was true, what happened to submariners who sailed those temporal depths? The clock ticked to 11:49 p.m. And in the sonar shack, Chief Reed made a discovery that would change everything.
"Officer of the deck, sonar, I need you and the captain down here immediately." Reed's voice over the intercom had an edge I'd never heard before. Not quite panic, but close. Professional composure barely holding against something that had deeply unsettled him. Hawthorne and I made our way to the sonar shack, leaving Martinez in command of the control room. The small compartment was cramped with electronic equipment, waterfall displays showing cascading frequency data, and 3 sonar technicians hunched over their consoles. The air smelled of electronics and the particular tang of stressed humans in a confined space. Reed pointed to his main display. "Sir, I've been analyzing the acoustic signal in detail, and I found something in the modulation pattern." He pulled up a different visualization, showing the signal broken down into components. "This is the 1 Hz carrier wave we've been tracking, but look at what's modulated on top of it." He highlighted specific sections. At first, I couldn't see what he was trying to show me. Just noise, random variation in signal strength. But then he applied a filter, and patterns emerged. "These are timestamps," Reed said quietly, "encoded in the signal modulation. Dates and times, using a format that matches our naval chronometer system, and they're counting backward." He showed us the progression. Each pulse carried a timestamp that was exactly 3 seconds earlier than the previous pulse, like a countdown, but instead of the future, toward the past. "How far back does it go?" Hawthorne asked. Reed scrolled through his analysis. "Sir, I've got recordings going back to when we first arrived at these coordinates 8 hours ago. The timestamps in the signal have been counting backward the entire time. At the current rate, they're regressing approximately 1 hour for every hour of real time that passes." "Meaning?" "Meaning, if we stay here long enough, the signal's timestamps will reach 0. And according to the progression I'm seeing, that happens in approximately 47 hours from now, well within our 48-hour investigation window." I felt cold. "What happens when it reaches 0? "Unknown, sir. But there's more." Reed pulled up another analysis. "I started looking at the higher frequency harmonics that appeared before the signal collapsed to a pure tone. Those harmonics, they weren't just random.
They were sonar reflections. Reflections from what? From us, sir. From the Razorback. I found our acoustic signature encoded in the harmonics, our reactor plant noise, propulsor cavitation, hull resonance, everything that makes us identifiable as a Virginia-class submarine. But the timestamps on those reflections were wrong. Wrong how? They were echoes from future moments, sir. Sonar returns from things we haven't done yet. I've got recordings of maneuvers we performed an hour after I captured the audio, conversations from the control room that hadn't happened when I captured the audio. Hawthorne and I exchanged glances. What Reed was describing violated causality, effects occurring before causes. The universe didn't work that way. Chief, are you certain this isn't equipment malfunction or data corruption? Reed nodded. I've verified it across 3 independent systems, sir. And it's not just sonar. I checked with navigation. Their inertial system has been logging position data that doesn't match our commanded movements. We think we've been maintaining position, but the nav system shows us drifting in a pattern that makes no sense spatially. But if you plot it temporally? Temporally? If you plot our position over time instead of space, we're moving in a perfect spiral, like we're orbiting something. But the orbit is in the time dimension, not the space dimension. I tried to wrap my head around that. A submarine moving through time, orbiting some temporal feature like a moon orbiting a planet. It was incomprehensible, yet somehow Reed's data seemed to support it. We need to leave. This is beyond our capability to investigate safely. I tried that, remember? The clock hands reversed. Something won't let us ascend. Then we go deeper. If we can't go up, maybe we can navigate laterally out of this temporal anomaly. Or, Reed said quietly, we complete the investigation, gather data until the countdown reaches 0, and see what happens. Hawthorne looked at him. That's not a serious suggestion, Chief. Sir, with respect, we might not have a choice. If we're trapped in some kind of temporal gravity well, we can't escape by conventional maneuvering. The only way out might be through. Let the countdown complete, experience whatever happens at 0, and hope it releases us. Or it kills us, I said. That's also a possibility, Reed admitted. We stood in the sonar shack, weighing impossible options. Stay and risk whatever happened when the countdown completed, try to escape and risk being trapped in temporal loops forever. Or, what if we go deeper? The countdown is measuring backward from some 0 point. What if we descend further and reach that 0 point directly instead of waiting for it to count down to us? Reed's eyes widened. You mean actively navigate downward in time instead of passively waiting for time to drag us backward? Exactly. If depth and time are somehow connected here, maybe we can control our temporal position by controlling our depth. Hawthorne considered this. It's insane, but so is everything else. All right, we'll try a controlled descent, not to escape, but to investigate. We'll go down slowly, monitor the clack gauge, and see if increased depth corresponds to increased temporal displacement.
We returned to the control room, and Hawthorne explained the plan to Martinez and Greer. Both looked skeptical, but couldn't offer better alternatives. Dive. Make your depth 600 meters, Hawthorne ordered. Descent rate 5 meters per minute, slow and controlled. As we began to descend, I watched the clock gauge intently. The hour and minute hands continued their normal forward movement. The second hand ticked steadily, but I noticed something new. A fourth hand had appeared, even smaller than the others, moving very slowly. Captain, there's a fourth hand on the clock now, I reported. Everyone looked. The tiny hand was barely visible, painted a different color than the others, a deep red, where the time hands were brass. It moved so slowly, you had to watch for several seconds to see any motion at all. What's it measuring? Martinez asked. I had no idea. Hours, minutes, and seconds were accounted for. What other time measurement would need a fourth hand? We descended through 550 meters, 575 meters, 600 meters. The the clock hands began to slow down. Not much at first, just a subtle decrease in the second hand's ticking rate. But as we went deeper, the effect became more pronounced. The second hand started taking 2 seconds to complete each tick, then 3 seconds, then 5. "Time is dilating," Greer said from the navigation station. "We're experiencing time at a different rate than the outside world." "How can you tell?" Hawthorne asked. She pointed to her chronometer, a precision timepiece used for navigation. "Sir, my chronometer is synchronized with atomic clocks via our satellite connection. It shows 0014, 12:14 a.m., but the clock gauge shows 23:51, 11:51 p.m. We are experiencing time slower than surface vessels." I did the math. When the gauge had first transformed, it had shown 23:47. In the 20-plus minutes since then, only 4 minutes had passed on the clock. We were experiencing time at about a fifth of normal rate, and we were still descending. 650 meters. The second hand was now taking 10 seconds to complete each tick. 700 meters, 20 seconds per tick. "Dive, all stop, maintain depth at 700 meters. We leveled off. The time dilation held steady at whatever rate we'd reached. Looking at the clock was surreal, watching the second hand move in slow motion, taking half a minute to complete what should take 1 second. Reed called up from sonar. "Sir, the acoustic signal is changed again. Multiple carrier frequencies now, arranged in harmonic series, and the timestamps are accelerating backward. For every minute of real time, they're regressing 5 minutes. The temporal effect was amplifying as we descended. Deeper water didn't mean more pressure here, it meant more time displacement. We were diving into the past, and the deeper we went, the faster we traveled backward." "What's our current depth on the analog pressure gauges?" Hawthorne asked. The dive officer checked his instruments. "Sir, the backup digital depth gauge shows 700 meters, but the analog gauge, the one that transformed into a clock, that's showing..." He paused. "Sir, it's showing 0. 0 depth. We were at the surface according to the clock gauge, despite being 700 meters down according to every other system. Or rather, we weren't at the surface, we were at 0 time, the beginning point, the moment everything in this area had started. All engines back 1/3, Hawthorne ordered suddenly. Emergency ascent to 500 meters, now. The Razorback's reactor increased power, driving our propulsor to push us upward through the water. We felt the deck angle bow up as we began to rise. The clock hand spun forward, accelerating wildly. Minutes blurred into hours. The hour hand whipped around the dial, days passing in seconds. "All stop!" Hawthorne shouted. We halted our ascent. The clock hands slowed, stopped their forward spin, and settled on a new time, 03:27 a.m. More than 4 hours had passed on the clock, while we'd spent maybe 30 seconds ascending. Time had leaped forward, dragging us with it. "Depth?" Hawthorne asked. 650 meters, the dive officer reported. "We're still below our starting point." We'd tried to return to 500 meters, but only made it to 650, and in the attempt, we jumped forward in time by 4 hours. "Sir, I think we're caught in a temporal current. We can navigate within it, but we can't escape it. Going deeper takes us backward in time. Ascending takes us forward, but we can't reach our origin point." It was like being caught in an ocean current that flowed through time instead of space. We could move within the flow, but fighting against it just swept us further downstream. "Options?" Hawthorne asked the room. No one had good answers. We were trapped in temporal water, unable to surface, unable to navigate free. The only direction we could safely move was deeper, further back in time, towards whatever 0 point the signal was counting down to. "Captain," I said slowly, "I think we need to go all the way down, descend to full depth, and reach the 0 point. That might be the only way to understand what's happening and find a way out." "You're suggesting we deliberately travel backward in time." "I'm suggesting we stop fighting the current and see where it leads.
This entire area is some kind of temporal anomaly. The signal, the clock gauge, the countdown, they're all trying to show us something. Maybe we need to let them. Hawthorne was quiet for a long moment. Chief Reed, if we descend to full depth, what's your projection for temporal displacement? Reed did some quick calculations. Sir, based on the progression we've observed, full depth, say 1,000 meters, would place us approximately 72 hours in the past, 3 days before we arrived at these coordinates, and the signal's countdown
would reach zero at about the same point. Depth and temporal displacement are linked. Going deep enough takes us to the moment the countdown began, which meant we'd find whatever started this anomaly, the source, the origin, possibly the answer to what was happening, or possibly our doom. All right, Hawthorne decided. We go deep, full investigation depth, but we do it slowly, controlled, ready to halt descent if anything looks too dangerous, and we document everything. He picked up the announcing system. All hands, this is the captain. We are beginning a deep dive to investigate the acoustic anomaly. This will be a slow, controlled descent to maximum depth. All personnel man your stations and report any unusual observations immediately. I thought about all the submarine training I'd done, all the emergency procedures I'd memorized. None of them covered this scenario, deliberately diving into temporal waters where depth equaled time and ascending meant jumping forward through days. But we'd committed to the course. The Razorback angled bow down and began her descent into the past. 750 meters. The clock showed 11:12 p.m., 35 minutes before we'd first arrived at these coordinates. We were descending into our own past. Reed's voice came over the intercom. Sir, we're picking up acoustic signatures, multiple contacts. They're our own sounds. Our reactor, our propulsor, our hull signatures from earlier in our approach. We were hearing ourselves from the future. The Razorback that existed 35 minutes from now, approaching these coordinates for the first time, unaware of what waited below. Can you filter those out? Hawthorne asked. Working on it, sir, but there are other sounds too. Multiple submarine signatures, different classes, different acoustic profiles. Soviet Victor class, Sierra class, American Los Angeles class, British Trafalgar class, all archived designs, old boats. How old? Sir, some of these signatures match submarines that were decommissioned in the 1980s and 90s. We were hearing ghosts, submarines that passed through this area decades ago, their acoustic signatures somehow preserved in the temporal waters like recordings. 800 meters. The clock showed 11:47 p.m. I noticed the crew was moving more slowly. Not intentionally, they were still executing their duties with professional efficiency, but their movements had taken on a sluggish quality. Martinez reached for a control switch, and his hand seemed to drift through the air rather than moving in a straight line. XO, are you feeling all right? I asked. He looked at me strangely. I'm fine. Why are you talking so fast? I wasn't talking fast. I was speaking normally. But to Martinez, experiencing time at a dilated rate, my normal speech sounded accelerated. Sir, Greer called out, the navigation system is showing temporal drift. We're not just displacing backward in time uniformly. Different parts of the ship are experiencing different rates of time passage. Elaborate, Hawthorne said. She pulled up a schematic showing the submarine's layout. Different sections were color-coded. The bow is experiencing slightly less time dilation than the stern. It's subtle but measurable. The difference is creating a temporal gradient along our length. We were being stretched through time. The front of the submarine existed a few milliseconds in the future relative to the back. Not enough to notice structurally, but enough to be detected by precision instruments. 850 meters. The clock showed 10:43 p.m. Captain, I'm getting reports from engineering, Martinez said. The reactor operators are experiencing disorientation. Time passage feels wrong to them. Some are reporting seeing equipment in multiple states simultaneously. Valves that are both open and closed, gauges showing different readings when they look away and look back. Quantum superposition. The reactor room was deep enough, far back in time, that objects were existing in multiple temporal states at once. Tell them to trust their instruments and maintain steady state. No unnecessary adjustments. We need the reactor stable. 900 meters. The clock showed 9:58 p.m. We'd gone back more than an hour now. The fourth hand on the clock, the tiny red one, had moved noticeably. It pointed to a marking on the dial I hadn't noticed before, a small symbol at the bottom of the gauge face. "That symbol," I said to Greer. "Can you make it out?" She leaned close. It looks like a zero. The fourth hand is measuring countdown to zero. And it was getting closer. As we descended, the red hand crept towards that zero marking. Reed called up again. "Sir, the acoustic environment is becoming extremely complex. I'm detecting layer upon layer of sounds, all from different time periods. It's like listening to every submarine that ever passed through this area simultaneously. Decades of traffic compressed into a single acoustic space." "Any pattern to it?" Hawthorne asked. "Yes, sir. It's converging. All the acoustic signatures, regardless of when they were originally made, are being drawn to a single point, like sound being sucked into a drain. A temporal singularity. All the sound from all the times compressed into one point, the zero point we were approaching. 950 meters. The clock showed 9:34 p.m. I started seeing things that weren't there, or more accurately, seeing things that hadn't happened yet, or had already happened. Hawthorne standing at a different position, Martinez sitting instead of standing, crew members who were on duty appearing in their berthing spaces, asleep. Is anyone else experiencing visual anomalies?
Several people nodded. The temporal gradient was becoming strong enough that we could see adjacent time frames bleeding into our present. 975 meters. The clock showed 9:11 p.m. The red countdown hand was nearly at zero. "Sir," Reed's voice was strained, "the signal has changed. It's no longer a steady tone. It's a pulse. One pulse every second. And each pulse is carrying massive amounts of data, more information than I can process." "What kind of data?" "Coordinates, timestamps, ship identifications. It's like a catalog. Every vessel that ever entered this area is being recorded, logged, stored somehow in the temporal structure. A catalog of everything that ever passed through, preserved in time, accessible by descending deep enough to reach the past when they'd been here. We were approaching a temporal archive, and we were about to become part of it. Sir, recommend we halt descent at 990 meters, I said. We're getting too close to the zero point. If we go further... The submarine shuddered, not from water pressure or hull stress, from something else. Reality rippling around us. The control room lights flickered, not an electrical fluctuation, they phased, becoming transparent for a moment, showing the control room as it had been hours ago, days ago, years ago. I saw different crews at the stations, different equipment configurations, the space itself in various states of construction and design. "Dive! All stop!" Hawthorne ordered, but the Razorback continued descending. The dive officer frantically worked his controls, but nothing responded. "Sir, we've lost depth control. The system is not responding to inputs." We were being pulled down. The temporal current had us and wouldn't let go. 1,000 meters. The clock showed 8:47 p.m. The red hand touched zero. Everything stopped. The reactor shut down. All electrical power died. Emergency lights failed. We were in complete darkness, complete silence, suspended in water that had stopped flowing, stopped existing in the normal way. Then, slowly, light returned. but not from our systems. The water around the submarine was glowing, not like bioluminescence. This was structured light, patterns moving through the ocean, like information flowing through circuits. And the patterns were visible through our hull, as if the steel had become transparent. I could see the ocean outside, but it wasn't water anymore. It was time, flowing past us in visible streams, currents of past and future, layers upon layers of temporal moments stacked vertically in the water column. I could see other submarines suspended in the flow, boats from different eras, all preserved at the depth corresponding to their temporal position. Above us, recent vessels, below, older ones. At the very bottom, the earliest submarines to ever enter this area, barely visible in the deep temporal past. We were in a preserve, a collection. Everything that ever crossed these coordinates was here, stored in temporal amber, existing simultaneously at different depths. And we'd just become part of the collection. "Captain," I heard myself say, though the sound was strange, distorted by temporal effects, "I think we've been cataloged." Hawthorne turned to look at me, and I saw that he was aging, not rapidly, but noticeably. Gray spreading through his hair, lines deepening on his face. He was experiencing time differently than I was, his personal chronometer running faster, or mine was running slower. Throughout the submarine, crew members were experiencing temporal desynchronization, some aging, some reversing, everyone experiencing time at slightly different rates. We were coming apart temporally, each person on their own unique timeline, while still physically occupying the same space. "We need to ascend," Martinez said. His voice was that of a much older man. "Now, before the effect becomes permanent." "The engines are dead," Hawthorne replied. His voice sounded younger. "We have no power, no propulsion." "Then we blow the ballast manually, emergency surface." But when they tried the manual controls, nothing happened. We were at zero depth on the temporal scale. There was no up from here. Ascending required power, required being part of normal time flow. At zero, we were outside that flow entirely. We were archived, stored, preserved like all the others. Chief Reed appeared in the control room. He looked haggard, aged significantly. "Sir, I've been analyzing our situation. I think I understand what this is." "Explain," Hawthorne said. "This isn't natural. This is artificial. Someone or something created a temporal storage system here. Submarines that enter this area are scanned, recorded, and preserved at a depth corresponding to when they arrived. The 0 point is the temporal anchor, the present moment when the system was created. Everything else is stored relative to that point." "Why? What's the purpose?" "Preservation? Study? I don't know. But I've found something else. There's a way out." Everyone turned to look at him. "The clock hands," he continued. "They're not just measuring time, they're controls. If we can manipulate them, we can navigate through the temporal structure, move up or down in time deliberately, instead of being locked at zero." "How do we manipulate hands on a physical gauge?" Martinez asked. "We already did. Remember when we tried to ascend and the hands spun backward? The clock is reading our intent, our attempt to navigate. We just need to focus that intent more precisely." It sounded insane, but everything about this situation was insane. "What do you propose?" Hawthorne asked. "We collectively visualize moving forward in time, not just ascending. That's spatial thinking. We need to think temporally. Imagine ourselves in the future, and the clock hands will respond. They'll move us there."
We'd been at this for hours now, or minutes, or days. Time had lost coherent meaning. "Everyone in the control room," Hawthorne said, making a decision. "Focus on a specific future moment. 3 hours from now. Visualize the clock showing 11:47 p.m. again, the moment we first arrived. Hold that image in your mind. We all concentrated, looking at the clock with its hands at zero, willing them to move forward, to take us out of this temporal dead zone and back to a time when we could escape. The small red countdown hand began to move, slowly at first, then faster. It swept around the dial, moving away from zero. The other hands followed, seconds, minutes, hours, all ticking forward. The glowing water outside started to flow again. Other submarines in the preserve began to move, repositioning themselves as we ascended through time layers. The Razorback shuddered. Power returned. Emergency lights flickered on. The reactor plant came back online. "Depth," Hawthorne demanded. 900 meters, the depth officer reported. "And climbing. We're ascending without ballast control. We're just rising." The clock showed 9:47 p.m. We'd moved forward an hour from zero. "Keep concentrating," urged Reed. "Keep visualizing forward movement." The ascent continued. 850 meters, 800, 750. At 700 meters, we hit resistance. The clock hands slowed their forward motion. Something was trying to hold us here, to keep us in the temporal preserve. "Push through it," Hawthorne said. "Everyone, focus harder." I concentrated on the moment we'd first detected the anomaly, the time before any of this had started, when we'd been a normal submarine on a normal mission. The resistance broke. We shot upward through the water, through the temporal layers, the clock hand spinning rapidly forward. 600 meters, 500, 400. The transparent hull became opaque again. The glowing water faded to normal darkness. Other submarines in the preserve vanished from view as we left that temporal space. 300 meters, 200 meters. "Surface, surface, surface," Hawthorne ordered. We punched through to the surface with emergency speed, the submarine breaking through into normal air, normal time, normal reality. The clock gauge still showed time, but the hands had stopped, frozen at 11:47 p.m., the moment we'd first arrived. We'd made it back, but not all of us. The first indication that something was wrong came when we tried to account for the crew. We'd surfaced at 0423 hours according to our ship's chronometers, having spent approximately 6 hours in the temporal anomaly. But when Chief of the Boat Thompson conducted a muster, the numbers didn't add up. We should have 134 crew members aboard. Thompson's count showed 127. 7 people were missing. "Run it again," Hawthorne ordered. "Check every compartment, every space. Someone could be in the head or sleeping through muster." They ran it again, and again. The count remained the same. 7 crew members who'd definitely been aboard when we began our descent were simply gone. I was in the control room when Reed brought the list of missing personnel to the captain. "Sir, I verified this against our manning documents and watch bills. These 7 sailors were logged as present when we started the investigation, but no one can remember seeing them after we descended past 800 meters. Hawthorne studied the list. 2 engineering watchstanders, 3 mess specialists, a junior sonar technician, and Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reed's own division officer. "Could they have fallen overboard somehow?" Martinez suggested, though his tone indicated he didn't believe it. "Negative, sir. We were buttoned up and submerged the entire time, and we'd have detected if someone opened a hatch. They just disappeared." I thought about what Reed had said in the temporal preserve, about being cataloged, recorded, stored at different depth time levels. What if these 7 crew members were stored at depths we'd passed through, but we hadn't been able to bring back with us? "Chief, during our time in the anomaly, did anyone report seeing crew members who looked strange, translucent maybe, or phasing in and out?" Reed nodded slowly. Several people mentioned seeing what they thought were hallucinations, crew members appearing and disappearing,
looking younger or older than they should. We attributed it to the temporal effects. What if those weren't hallucinations? What if those crew members were experiencing more severe desynchronization than the rest of us? What if they got stuck in different time layers? Hawthorne's face was grim. You're suggesting they're still down there, trapped in the preserve, or dispersed across different times, lost in the temporal structure. We sat in heavy silence, contemplating 7 crew members scattered across time, possibly forever trapped in moments they couldn't escape from. "We need to report this to Sublant," Martinez said. "Request guidance." "Negative. Not yet. First, I want to understand what happened to the rest of the crew. Everyone who made it back, I want full medical and psychological evaluations before we send any messages." He was right to be cautious. Over the next 12 hours, as we remained surfaced and conducted thorough examinations, the extent of the damage became clear.
32 crew members showed signs of accelerated aging. Not traumatic, 5 to 10 years beyond their actual age, but measurable. Their bodies had experienced more time than had actually passed. 18 showed the opposite, biological ages younger than when they deployed. They'd somehow de-aged, their cells reverting to earlier states. The remaining crew, including myself, showed temporal inconsistencies that didn't fit simple aging or de-aging. Our chronological biomarkers, telomeres, cellular degradation patterns, accumulated cellular damage showed random variation, as if different parts of our bodies had aged at different rates. "It's like we were pulled apart temporally and put back together slightly wrong," the ship's corpsman explained. "Everyone's biological clock is running at a different rate now, some faster than normal, some slower." But the physical effects weren't the worst part. The memories were the worst part. People started reporting memories that didn't match, events they remembered happening differently than others recalled. Some crew members remembered taking different routes through the submarine during the descent. Others remembered conversations that their supposed participants didn't recall having. I experienced it too. I had clear memories of watching the depth gauge transform into a clock, but I also had equally clear memories of it remaining a normal gauge throughout the entire event. Both memories felt real, both seemed accurate, but they couldn't both be true. "We've experienced temporal bifurcation," Reed explained during a briefing with the senior officers. "When we descended into the preserve, we probably split into multiple temporal threads, different versions of ourselves, experiencing slightly different sequences of events. When we ascended, those threads didn't fully merge. We're carrying memories from our different temporal selves." "Is it permanent?" Hawthorne asked. "Unknown, sir, but I suspect yes. Our brains were literally in different times simultaneously. The memories got encoded in those different temporal states. Merging back into normal time couldn't erase that." I thought about the 7 missing crew members. Had they experienced too much bifurcation, split into so many different temporal threads that no single version of them could exist anymore? 3 days after surfacing, we received orders to return to base via the most direct route. No stops, no additional tasking. Sublant wanted us back immediately. The transit was quiet. Crew members stayed in their bunks more than usual, avoiding each other, because when you couldn't trust your own memories, couldn't be certain which version of events had actually occurred, conversation became difficult. I'd ask someone if they remembered a particular watch rotation, and they'd give me an answer that contradicted what I recalled. Not lying, genuinely remembering it differently. And we'd both be right, in a way. We'd both experienced our own versions of events. The depth gauge remained frozen at 11:47 p.m. throughout the transit. The clock hands never moved. Engineering tried to remove it and install a replacement, but the gauge wouldn't budge. It was as if it had fused with the submarine's structure on a molecular level. So we sailed with a permanent reminder of what had happened, a clock that showed the exact moment we entered the temporal anomaly and would show that moment forever. When we finally reached port in Groton, we found a reception committee that wasn't the usual homecoming crew. Naval intelligence officers in civilian clothes, medical personnel with security clearances, buses with blacked-out windows waiting to transport us to debriefing facilities. We never returned to our homes or families. We went directly into isolation. Part 5. Present Day. The wall clock in my kitchen is ticking counterclockwise again. I've stopped trying to understand why. Dr. Vance would say it's a hallucination, a visual processing error caused by my temporal desynchronization, but I know better. It's the other times bleeding through, the other versions of now, where clocks run backward, where cause follows effect instead of the reverse. Ever since the Razorback brought us back from that temporal preserve, I've been experiencing all possible timelines simultaneously. Most people can't do that. Most people are locked into one timeline, one sequence of events. I'm not most people anymore. None of the Razorback crew are. The Navy kept us isolated for 6 months. Tests, debriefings, medical evaluations. They wanted to understand what had happened to us, wanted to know if we posed a threat to, what? National security? Reality itself? They finally released us when they realized we weren't dangerous, just broken, experiencing time in ways that made us unreliable witnesses to our own lives. The Navy provides excellent benefits, though. Monthly disability checks, full medical coverage, therapy. They take care of their own, especially those who might talk about classified temporal anomalies if not properly compensated. I check my watch. It shows 3:45 p.m. My phone shows 2:17 p.m. The kitchen clock shows 11:47 p.m. Always 11:47 p.m. Has been since the day I got home. 3 different times, all equally valid from my perspective. I've learned to navigate it, keep appointments based on what my phone shows, take medication based on what my watch shows, ignore the kitchen clock entirely, except as a reminder of where this all started. My sister Rachel has stopped calling as often, not because she doesn't care, but because conversations with me have become surreal experiences for her. I'll reference things she hasn't told me yet. I'll forget things she told me yesterday, because in my timeline, that conversation hasn't happened.
Last week, or maybe next week, the order isn't clear, she visited my apartment. She looked at the kitchen clock showing 11:47 p.m. at 3 in the afternoon and asked, very carefully, if I'd considered having it removed. I can't, I told her. It's always been there. Chris, you just moved into this apartment 4 months ago. You hung that clock yourself when you moved in. Yes, I agreed, and it's always been there. Both things are true. She didn't understand. How could she? She exists in one timeline where cause precedes effect and time moves in one direction only. I exist in all timelines simultaneously, always have, always will. Ever since 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in March, when our depth gauge grew clock hands and showed me that time was just another dimension we could navigate if we went deep enough. Dr. Vance thinks medication and therapy will eventually restore my temporal coherence, get me back to experiencing linear time like normal people. She's wrong. You can't unsee what I've seen, can't unknow what I know. Time isn't a river flowing in one direction, it's an ocean, and I've been to the depths where past, present, and future exist simultaneously. The 7 crew members who disappeared, I see them sometimes, not hallucinations, actual sightings of them existing in other time layers that briefly intersect my own. They're fine, mostly, living their lives in whatever temporal threads they got stuck in. One of them is always a year younger than he should be, living the same 12 months over and over. Another experiences time backward, getting younger each day until he reaches infancy, then resetting to old age and starting over. They're trapped in loops. I'm trapped in chaos, but we're all trapped. The depth gauge on the Razorback is still frozen at 11:47 p.m. The Navy hasn't been able to remove it or make it work normally again. I heard through my VA disability case manager that they eventually decommissioned the boat, deemed her structurally compromised by whatever happened in that temporal preserve. But really, they just didn't want a submarine that had become unstuck in time, experiencing all moments of its existence simultaneously. Hard to operate a vessel when the control room experiences Tuesday while the engine room experiences Thursday. I pour another cup of coffee, even though I'm not sure what time of day it is. The bourbon bottle sits next to the coffee pot. Sometimes I drink coffee for breakfast, sometimes bourbon, sometimes both, depending on which timeline I'm experiencing most strongly at the moment. My phone buzzes, a text from Dr. Vance. "Missed appointment today, please reschedule." I check my calendar. The appointment is tomorrow, or was yesterday, or is happening right now in a timeline I'm not currently perceiving. I text back, "Sorry, we'll call to reschedule." I won't, though. What's the point? She can't help me. No one can. You can't fix temporal desynchronization with talk therapy and antidepressants. The only cure would be going back to those coordinates, descending to the 0 point again and staying there, becoming fully part of the preserve, existing outside of time entirely. Sometimes I think about doing that, convincing the Navy to let me aboard a submarine heading to the Norwegian Sea, finding those coordinates where the 0 point still exists, always exists, will always exist, because it's outside the normal flow of time. Descending past 1,000 meters to where the water glows with visible time streams and submarines from across decades float suspended in their archival depths. Letting the temporal preserve take me completely this time. No attempt to ascend, just accepting the catalog, the storage, the preservation. Becoming a permanent part of that collection where all times exist simultaneously and coherently, instead of chaotically. It would be peaceful, in a way. No more competing memories, no more contradictory timelines, just existence at 0 depth on the temporal scale, where past and future collapse into a single eternal moment. But I don't do it. Haven't yet, anyway. Because despite the confusion, despite the temporal chaos, despite experiencing my life out of order and remembering things that haven't happened and forgetting things that have, I'm still here, still breathing, still thinking, still aware. And as long as that's true, there's a chance that someday I'll find my way back to linear time, back to experiencing one moment after another in proper sequence. That chance is small, growing smaller as the temporal desynchronization worsens, but it exists. The wall clock ticks counterclockwise, my watch ticks forward, my phone's clock flickers between multiple times, and I sit in my kitchen, existing in all moments simultaneously, drinking coffee or bourbon or both, writing this account for people who experience time normally and have no framework to understand what I'm describing. But I write it anyway, because someone should know what waits at those coordinates in the Norwegian Sea. Someone should know what happens when submarines descend deep enough that depth stops measuring distance and starts measuring time. Someone should know that the ocean has places where the normal rules don't apply, where instruments transform, showing dimensions they weren't designed to measure, where depth gauges grow clock hands and time flows downward instead of forward. And someone should know that if you go there, if you descend to the 0 point at the bottom of the temporal preserve, you'll never experience time normally again. You'll become like me, unstuck, desynchronized, existing in all moments simultaneously, forever trapped at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in March, when everything changed, the moment that never ends.